This program is made possible by generous program underwriting by
Thank you very much for coming tonight. We have up on the board here 4 figures that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about Bridget Biddy Mason, and we're going to talk about Dr. John Strother Griffin, and we're going to talk about Judge Benjamin Hayes, and we're going to talk about John Chauncey Hayes. So our story is going to begin with the travels of these 4 people to come to the city of Los Angeles. So I'm going to start out with Dr. Griffin. Dr. Griffin is born in Fincastle, Virginia in 1816. And when he is at the age of 9, he's orphaned. His mother and father are both deceased. So he goes to live with his maternal uncle, George Hancock. And his uncle provides him a classic education. And he attends the University of Pennsylvania, where he receives his medical degree in 1837. And he also has another famous uncle, and that is William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, Griffin in 1840 is appointed surgeon in the Army. He joins the Army, and he's serves under William Worth in Florida with the rank of captain. In 1846, he came to California with General Kearny, and he was the surgeon at the San Pasqual battlefield, and he was Kearny's surgeon there. Then he visited the gold country, up where the 49ers were panning for gold, and he resigned from service in 1854 and returned to the city of Los Angeles. So that's where we're going to stop with Dr. Griffin. Now, August 15th, 1888 is when Biddy is born, Bridget Biddy Mason. She's born in Hancock County, Georgia. She's born a slave. And her life is spent in a family who owns her. She has no freedom of her own. When she's 17, she's given to Rebecca and Robert Smith as a wedding present to come into their home. She works for the Smiths, and she learns about midwifing. She learns about herbology. She adapts to her home and her life, but she's also responsible for the Smith children. The Smiths decide, they've heard about the Mormon Church, so they decide they're going to join the Mormon Church. So they're going to trek and leave their home in Mississippi, and they're going to go across the United States with this Mormon group of people in a wagon train. There are hundreds of animals, wagons, and people. And now it's Biddy's job to not only tend children, but it's her job to herd cattle, herd sheep, follow behind the wagons without riding, by walking. So she's on the journey to walk to her freedom. They get to Utah, and then the Smiths decide that they're going to travel further to California. So they arrive in California in 1851. So we've got Biddy in California now. Now we're going to talk about Benjamin Hayes. Benjamin Hayes was born in 1815. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland. He was educated in Maryland. He went to St. Mary's College, and at 24, he had completed his education and was graduated with a law degree. He then traveled to Missouri as a young man, where he met his wife, and he published a newspaper there, a temperance paper, and he practiced law and was admitted to the bar. But then, the call of California, 1849, he was interested in pursuing a different avenue of life, so he decided to go overland to California. Well, Benjamin wrote diaries, and he kept track of all of these situations that he found himself in while he was traveling across the United States to get to Los Angeles. So he arrives in 1851. So this is basically where our story begins. Well, Dr. Griffin is practicing medicine in Los Angeles. Benjamin has been elected the first federal judge of Southern California. And Biddy is living in San Bernardino with the Smith family. And she's tending the children. There are many children that have come across this journey with her. She has a friend named Hannah who has many children. There are 14 in all children, I believe, that are part of this story. Biddy's made friends with many people. She arrived in 1851. So the Owens family were friends of hers. And the young gentleman of the Owens family, Charles, he fell in love with Biddy's daughter, Ellen. So when he heard that they were going to leave and be removed by their slave owner, Mr. Smith, they were discouraged and worried. So in the records that we read that two men went to Judge Hayes and said that they wanted these people not to go. So he issued a writ of habeas corpus, which means produce the body. So the sheriff went out to the campsite and took into protective custody Biddy, her children, Hannah, and her children. And he kept them from Smith by sequestering them in the jailhouse. That was the safest place where they could be, because Smith's foreman was trying to encourage them to go to Texas. And so the judge taking this case on, this was late in December and of 1855. So in January, the court case starts. So if you're a slave or black, you can't testify in a court of law. If your master has testimony against you, you can't defend yourself. So Judge Hayes had to figure out a way to bring the information of the case to light. So he has Biddy and Hannah couldn't come because she was ill. She had just given birth to an infant boy, so she wasn't able to come to the courthouse. But the judge nevertheless interviewed Biddy, and she said she's always done what she's been told. After interviewing Smith, the judge knew that there was something wrong. So he took them into protective custody, and he declared that they were free forever. Well, Biddy was very happy, and she went back to Judge Hayes and made him write out the papers that gave her freedom. Because, remember, this case is before the Dred Scott decision is final and before the Emancipation Proclamation. And back in those days, even if you were free, someone could come and kidnap you and take you to a slave state and put you back in servitude. So Biddy wanted to make sure that she was going to be able to prove that she was free. Now, we have the court case, and they're all free. Now, there are more details on this, of course, because we can read in the history books, we can read the testimony from the case. But this is where our story begins. About a month after this court case was over, and Biddy had gone to live with the Owens family from San Bernardino. She had moved from her campsite to live with the Owens. She came to town, and about a month later, I'm going to read you. This is by Benjamin Hayes. An interesting remembrance occurs to me at the moment in the year 1856 at Los Angeles, with public opinion against me. I tried the case of 14 Negroes claiming the protection of writ of habeas corpus. I discharged them as entitled to freedom. I was denounced as an abolitionist for declaring a simple proposition of law, for granting a clear constitutional right. Even at Sacramento, I was damned, so Governor Downey informed me. A month passed. One day, my little boy from a buggy under the heels of the horses, one of these same poor Negro women whom Providence placed nearby, rushed under the very wheels and snatched him from death. If a judge could be repaid for a duty performed by him, what do you think can be the measure of my reward in such a circumstance? If, dear Jack, you had a boy and one only, you would feel as I do, and yet your kindness of heart will teach you what must be the lively gratitude of a father who has escaped from such a danger. This incident has always seemed to be one of the most singular in my brief career. Benjamin Hayes. So, if you can imagine riding in a buggy, you're a frail mother who 10 months earlier has lost her daughter, and you're riding with a little boy who's not quite 3, and your husband, and suddenly your baby falls out on the street from the height of a buggy, or the horse's feet could kill him. And this woman is there. She is, God has placed her right there at that corner. And she rushes under to save his life and puts that child back in his mother's arms. That's incredible. Now, what would a parent and what would parents have done if their child had sustained such an injury? They'd go to the doctor. Well, Benjamin's brother-in-law is Dr. Griffin. Now, we have heard the story of Biddy, but without this letter from Benjamin, we only could surmise how Dr. Griffin would have gotten to know Biddy and would have hired her. But I attest to the fact that I believe that he was grateful that the life of his nephew was saved. And he knew that Biddy had nursing capabilities and was able to help him in his practice. So he hired Biddy, and he paid her $2.50 a day. Now, Dr. Griffin, not only was he a surgeon, but he was enterprising. This is when a city is being built, and people are buying land, and they're selling land, and they're building the buildings, and they're building a city. Well, the amount of association here for Biddy and all of these people that are in Los Angeles gives her such opportunity. But this is a woman whose life pursuit has always been helping others. So Biddy saves her money for 10 years, and she buys her first piece of property in downtown Los Angeles. And she's doing nursing, she's caring for people. She opens store accounts for people that can't pay their grocery bills. It doesn't matter what color they are, if they're Mexican, white, or black. They're needy people. So she pays their grocery bills. She visits prisons, and she takes blessings to those people that are incarcerated and in need of someone to care. So this is the legacy that Biddy has to today, is her ability, even though her past could have made her a very bitter person, she kept the love in her heart. And her policy, I want every one of you to get this. If your hand is closed, nothing good can come in. The open hand is blessed, for it gives in abundance as it receives. And that was her motto her whole life. Benjamin in Los Angeles, he was a modest man. He wasn't so interested in wealth as he was collecting California history. He cut the pages of his law books out, and he would put in articles commemorating an event that might have occurred. And he compiled a huge scrapbook collection of pictures and anything that would represent the beginning of the state's history. He served as a judge for 10 years, and then he retired. But during that 10 years in Los Angeles, the amazing things happened with the development of the city. He traveled by circuit, so he wasn't there all the time. His jurisdiction was San Bernardino, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Well, shortly after Biddy rescued Chauncey from this accident, his mother Emily died of consumption. So Chauncey was left without his mother and his father being away. So he went to live with Dr. Griffin and his aunt Louise. Now Louise was the first paid school teacher in Los Angeles, and back then schools were integrated. You can see on the storyboards here that we have a picture of the school on Spring Street. Well, also he lived with Mr. Eaton. His other aunt joined his father in Los Angeles, so he had two homes. But Biddy worked for Dr. Griffin, so Biddy would have seen Chauncey Hayes on a regular basis. And he never would have forgotten the woman who saved him from death. I can't imagine a family ever forgetting that. And this letter that I read to you was written 10 years after the event because he was remembering. Now, another thing about Biddy is she passed her heroism on to her daughter, Harriet. In 1866, on Chauncey's birthday, he was 10, Harriet worked for the Banning family. Phineas Banning was a gentleman who had a stage line. He was very wealthy. And he also had a steamer that would take passengers to the main steamships that traveled up and down the California coast. Well, on this day, about 5 o'clock in the evening, the steamship boiler blew up. And Harriet and a lot of very important people were on that steamship. She was taking care of the Banning children. Well, they were blown into the water. And Harriet's just a teenager, but she kept the Banning children afloat, an 18-month-old boy and a 3-year-old boy, until a rescue could be made. So, this amazing woman has a connection with Oceanside because John Chauncey Hayes, when he was older and graduated Santa Clara College, came to San Diego with his father, and he started looking into land. He was a justice of the peace. When he came to Oceanside, he had a vision. And I want to tell you, he was like a Renaissance man. He learned from all these people in Los Angeles, his family members. He had accumulated all this interest, and so he was going to put it to work. So he decided to buy land, and he bought land, and he bought more land. Then he was the banker. He owned the bank, the motor transit company. He owned the stage line. He owned the brickyard. He owned the lumber yard. He married Philippa Marone of the Marone family, and they had 14 children. Now, there's a very important thing here, because we've in this story, Benjamin Hayes had to make a decision. He had to make a decision about this case. Obviously, his peers were telling him not to do this. Don't be involved in this. Even the governor said, don't get involved. But he said it was their constitutional right to be free. So he did what he thought was the right thing. If he hadn't, Biddy would have been in Texas. Well, then a month later, who would have been on the corner to save Chauncey from death? So when we make decisions, we never know the consequences and how it will affect other people. And I can't imagine what life would be like, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Biddy Mason. And that's an amazing thing to me. All this history, all tied up into these individual people and what they accomplished. Dr. Griffin went on to become the father of East LA. He founded the Medical Association up there and the Farmers and Merchants Bank. I mean, everyone was successful. Biddy became a philanthropist. She started an orphanage. She was the founder of the AME Church. What would we do without these folks? What would we have done without Biddy? But it was her kindness of heart that made these things happen. I believe that. I don't know if any of you have any questions for me, but I'd be happy to answer your questions about this case and about Biddy. I'll do my best. But we have some special guests here this evening. you might not be aware of. These three ladies here sitting in the front row are Biddy Mason's descendants, and this is her great, 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 great grandson, Daniel. This is Linda. Would you please stand? This is Linda Brown, Cheryl Cox. Oh my, and I've only, help me out. Robin, please forgive me because I hadn't met Robin before, just a few minutes before this evening. But these are Biddy's descendants. And I thank you so much for coming tonight. So maybe you'll help me out if somebody has a question that I won't know the answer to. Anyone want to ask me a question? Yes.
When again was Biddy born?
She was born in 1815. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. 1818.
You talked about buying land at that time. Was that Spanish, Mexican land grants?
Well, of course, we know before California became a state that Spain was here, and there were land grants. So yes, most everything was part of either the church or a land grant at that time. The land that Biddy bought, she made her family promise that they would keep it in the family, their homestead that they purchased, their house. So Linda will have to tell us if that is still in the family. No. Well, in researching Biddy, her grandson and she went into the livery business together. And he was quite a dapper gentleman. His picture's over on the story wall, and he's quite a handsome fellow. Now, he was at one time the richest black man in Los Angeles.
Shelley, I was curious, why did they, when they became members of the Mormon Church and then they went to Utah, why did they decide to go on to California?
Well, according to the record, Brigham Young was wanting to have missionaries in California, so he sent a group together to go ahead on to San Bernardino, and the Smiths joined him a little bit later after that.
And one more follow-up. When he made the historic decision that Biddy should be free, did that become any kind of a precedent, or was there so much going on elsewhere that this sort of got overlooked?
California was a free state, and Biddy is probably the first black woman in maybe the United States to own property and be free, because this is before the Civil War.
Black folks throughout the United States by that time were owning property legally all over the place, including in slave states.
Well, I have
As a matter of fact,
I have a map up here, and it shows, this is the map of 1850, and it shows you in red what are free states.
well, I understand that, but what I'm suggesting then is that in free states, as well as in slave states, free blacks own property. And there were hundreds of thousands of them. I mean, it wasn't common, it wasn't every day, it certainly wasn't nearly as much as it should have been, but they did own property.
Well, we're saying that Biddy is the first woman, first black woman in California to own property. But I don't know if she's the first free woman in the United States to own property. We're speaking about women, not just basically not talking about men. We're talking about women. I don't know historically what to your challenge. I don't know the answer. Yes.
The properties that you said were purchased by John Chauncey Hayes and the businesses that
Yes, they were all in Oceanside. Yes, Myers had 160 acres, and he turned it over to John Chauncey. John Chauncey had 1,200 acres of land, and he was a developer of South Oceanside. He owned, actually in 1928, the Hayes family donated a mile of beach to the city from the pier south to Myers Street, but John Chauncey owned all the way to the lagoon, because when he was developing, he was going to go on into Carlsbad to develop. But the time and the money played out, so that didn't occur. Yes?
Was he involved in the early Oceanside, city or?
Absolutely, he was the Justice of the Peace. He wrote the governing authority for the San Luis Rey Valley. And he was the San Luis Rey correspondent for the Union Tribune newspaper from 1870 to 1890. And he owned the South Oceanside Diamond newspaper also. That was the newspaper that he produced. In college, he wrote the Owl at Santa Clara College, so that kind of rubbed off on him. And he actually played a little baseball down in San Diego when he was down there with his dad for a short term. But he was all business. I'll read you what it says here about Chauncey. Mr. Hayes has been a resident of Oceanside for the past 64 years, being one of the founders of the city. Nothing but prairie land was Oceanside when he first came here, and it was his pleasure to know every little house built, of every activity of the village that grew during his lifetime to a thriving little city. During his active life in Oceanside, the deceased was credited with wielding greater influence both financially and politically than any other single individual in the history of the community. He poured his money by the thousands into enterprises that secured his approval. Not only did he operate the real estate office, but he was the banker, the attorney, the editor of the newspaper, and politically he was the most powerful man in North San Diego County. So,
And we're not called Aysville?
No, he was interested in building a city. He'd start a business and then he'd sell the business, just to promote it. He brought train excursions of people to Oceanside so they'd invest and buy land, and he'd put articles in the Los Angeles newspaper, and he'd charge them $1 to ride the train down here to look around and buy property. You could buy a beachfront lot for $100 back in the day. Yes?
Now, I'm assuming you're a direct descendant from Chauncey?
Yes, I'm his great-granddaughter.
Okay. And first question. And second question, did he stay in contact with Biddy over the years after he moved to Oceanside?
Well, I think that Biddy had an influence on him because he donated land for the Methodist Episcopal Church in Oceanside. So he did travel to Los Angeles, and I'm sure that he would have stopped in and, been aware. I don't think you could know someone the way he knew Biddy or the family and not know how they were doing. I could just imagine the conversations that she would have had of a little boy sitting outside, not doing what he was supposed to do, and just everyday life. That's the most amazing part of this. I mean, we read stories and we tell stories, but to personalize them and imagine what their conversations would have been, or imagine the time and the place and what was going on, is utterly amazing to me. When I found out about the letter, I was in search to find descendants of Biddy because I wanted to personally meet them. And about a month or two ago, I attended a lecture in San Pedro at the Banning House, and there was a lecture on Harriet and giving Harriet credit for saving the Banning children. And there, to my great surprise, was Linda and her daughter And now I've met Robin and Daniel. So we never know what our decisions are going to be like. Yes?
I'm wondering about the Smith family after having been involved. I'm wondering about the Smith family after having been involved in a historic case like that. Did they continue to own slaves? Did they kind of rethink that whole idea? Did it make any difference?
Well, after his foreman tried to persuade Hannah not to go to Texas instead of staying in California, the judge made all the court costs on Smith's head, and so he left town. He realized he wasn't going to get any slaves to take with him, so he finally left. But the court did continue to take care of and were guardians of Hannah and her children. And I didn't know that until I'd read the court papers, but I found that was interesting. Yes?
The Biddy family descendants, do they live in Oceanside or LA?
They live in Los Angeles, I believe. Anyone here? It's fine.
Do you know whether or not there was a connection between Biddy and the first mayor of Los Angeles, who was an African American?
Pico.
Yeah. Is there a connection? It would seem like it would be a kind of a small world for the two.
They knew each other.
They knew each other, but I'm related to Pio Pico. My fourth great grandmother traveled with Anza to colonize San Francisco, and she became the grandmother of Pio Pico and Andres Pico. So his grandmother is my fourth great grandmother. There's a tapestry here, and every family has a tapestry. And if you take the time to get to know your family members and you look at the old pictures, you can find out what your story is. I had another question.
Is that how you started researching this particular, I mean, you were just looking back and then you found that letter and that's what started your hunt, or?
Well, when I was very young, my uncle had a large library, and he would give us all a reading assignment, and we'd come to the breakfast table. I'd visit in summer, and we'd have to report on what we read. Well, then I discovered that he was buying old books, and he was buying, antiquated books. And then I learned, that Benjamin was a ghostwriter for B.D. Wilson. And he wrote the Indian Report of 1852 for B.D. Wilson. So I got interested in that, but then of course, when you're a teenager, you go on to other things. And so then my father died, and I was 20, and I had inherited the home where I live, but I also inherited my father's debts. So that's when I started trying to save my rancho and my heritage. And the strangest thing happened. My aunt had been an attorney here with my uncle in Oceanside, and they were divorced. And she moved to Sacramento, and she put all these things in storage. And then she sold the property. So all of these important documents got thrown in the trash. Well, my cousin rescued them and brought them down to me. And one of them had a file, and it was on the genealogy, was written on it, and my name was written on it. So it was kind of like my uncle had pre-decided that I would be the keeper. So I've been doing school tours for third and fourth graders for 14 years. And we have been telling the story of Biddy, but tonight was the first night that we really went into the history of these 4 important people whose lives intertwined and created lots of different things that people have been blessed with. But I think that Biddy, she was salt and light. She radiated her spiritualness all through her life. I think that that is the most admirable of all. What? Well, I brought some books with me if you want to acquire them. I went on to Amazon and got them for a reduced price. But they're hard to come by. You can't just go to the bookstore and find all these books. So I have books that are written for children about Biddy, and Linda wrote the foreword for this book here. And I got this book, which is Dr. Griffin's diary. It says a doctor comes to California. And then this book is The Force of a Feather. And there are other books that I have in my basket. So there's a lot of good reading out there to research about Biddy. And yes.
Will we be able to hear from either of the descendants?
Oh, absolutely. I would love to do that. Would you come and join us?
My grandmother, who died, she was 99 when she died, I think around 1995 or somewhere in there. My daughter has to tell me what year she died. Oh, I'm sorry. She would tell me stories about Biddy, but mostly from what she had learned, because Ellen was her grandmother. And so most of the stories that we don't have a lot of history that came down through generations to generations. We just, we've kind of done research too to find out the information. We are the only 4 descendants of Biddy Mason. There are not a whole lot of kids. Ellen had 2 sons, and one of them was Robert Owens, and he had 2 daughters. And then one of them didn't have a kid, and Gladys was my grandmother. My grandmother had 1 son. I'm an only child, and those are my 2 daughters. So that's the limit. Harriet didn't have any kids, although she was married a number of times. And then there was a 3rd daughter that died when she was a teenager. What else can I tell you about her? She died from old age, that's all. Oh, the teenager? She got an infection, and so she just died from that. So at a young age, she's probably around 13 or 14, so she was real young when she died. The biggest story that we always had from Biddy, because we didn't know who was the father of her kids, and this was a story that came down from generation to generation, is that she had kids by an Indian chief. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. And when she came across the country, because it took like 8 or 9 months, I think, to walk. Well, the first time to get to Utah was 7 months, and then another 2 months to get to San Bernardino. That's a long time to walk. And she walked behind the wagons, and she took care of her 3 kids. One of them was a baby that she had in her arms. And then the kids she would take care of the Smith's kids as they came across, and all the animals, the horses, not the horses, the goats and whatever they had, the smaller, the livestock. And so she came across, and it took this long time to come across to California, and she ended up being here. But every night she would say that because her kids looked like Indians, that the Indians would come and steal her kids, and then she would have to go at nighttime and get her kids back from the Indians. Now, whether that's a true story, I don't know. It sounds amazing and everything else, but if you kind of look at us, we really don't look like, we kind of look more like Indians, like Cherokee or something like that. I was in Arkansas, and people came up to me and said, "You must be Cherokee," and I'm like, "No, not that I know of, no." But I think we have more of a mixture of an Indian type mixture than a combination of what I would say a white and a black mixture. Although on my father's side, the other side of my family, my father's side, also has a whole lot of people that were very important that they were inventors and everything. And my grandfather, he was a musician, so we have all these people that are in our family, and it's kind of amazing. At some point we hope to do a story about it. But if you have some questions, I'll try and answer them.
You know, out of curiosity, you can take a genetic test and maybe find out what, you know.
What combination? What combination I am? I thought about doing that, and my father just died last year, and so I really wanted to do that before he died, but we didn't get it done. And the biggest problem with that, I think, is that it's really not perfected from what I hear. Even though they say, oh, we kind of know where you come from, it's not as perfect as it should be. And I know what I'm going to end up with. I'm going to end up with a lot of white people on one side because I already know that my father's father was half Norwegian and half, French. So I already know that that's going to come out. So, so you know, it's just going to be such a combination. You just won't really end up with knowing, huh? Yeah. So as far as the property goes, we lost all the property in the Great Depression, and so there wasn't any that was left, and so we don't have any property that was left from that. But they did own a lot of property, and they did have a lot of money at that time, and it's all gone. Yeah. You know, I don't know when the orphanage closed. She started a school for African American kids. She started the orphanage. She would go into the hospitals and do a lot of work. She tried to feed people. There was a major storm that came along and flooding of Los Angeles, and she opened up. Anyone that needed food, she would just go and they could just sign. She signed saying use her name, and they would get free food. So there was a lot that she did. Any other questions? I hope I answered. Yes.
Because of my ties with AME Church. Where was the location of that particular church that she established, or is the one that's there now the same spot?
It's not in the same spot because one of the churches, it burned. And so it used to be on 8th and Town, but now it's the First AME Church that's on Harvard off of Adams. So it's the main one that's there. But that is the same church as she started. They started out of her home, actually. So and the very first year she paid the minister's salary, and she paid all the taxes on the church. She not only paid the taxes on that church, but she paid the taxes on a white church also. And she wasn't really a member of the First AME Church. She was a member of the white church. Now, I don't know why. You know, I don't have an answer for that one. Yes.
Now, I'm assuming she had no formal education. This was a lady who was a slave, as
Right.
educated as she could.
Right. She couldn't even sign her name. So she would sign with an X. And there's a wall downtown. There's a park that's named after her. It's the Biddy Mason Park that's downtown, where her original house was the Homestead House on 3rd and Spring. And so the city has put a park in there in honor of her. And on that wall, there's an X where she just signed her name with the X. But what she did do was that her daughter, now I don't know about Ellen, I don't know about Harriet, but Ellen went up north and to San Francisco, I believe it was, and she went with her son and learned how to read and write. So one of the daughters did. And so ever since then, we've all been kind of educated. Any other questions? Yes.
There's a lyric talking about your grandmother signing with an X.
Yes.
There was a Broadway show several years ago by Irving Berlin called Andy, Get Your Gun. And one of the lyrics went, my uncle down in Texas can't even write his name. He signed his checks with X's, but they cashed him just the same.
Oh, that's great. That's great, yes. Okay. I like that. I like that a whole lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Well, if any of the audience members would like to, if you have organizations or groups that you'd like to have a presentation done, I would be glad to come to your church or to your organization and do this for you. I really love this story, and I love sharing this story because it has value beyond history. So let's remember. Did I read you this already? Well, let's remember to put this. Well, I made some so everybody can have one in their wallet. We'll share this.
This program is made possible by generous program underwriting by